Welcome to the Trailblazers. I'm Perry Rarick, your host and chief editor of Follow Your Buyer. The purpose of this interview series is to share with you interesting discussions I have with trailblazing thought leaders. They're innovative, thought-provoking. They're not afraid to challenge the status quo, and they serve as vanguards for positive change. Returning for a second Trailblazer guest appearance is Annie Dunleavy. She is the Executive Vice President and U.S. Head of Content Strategy for Edelman Business Marketing. She's highly creative, data-driven. She's a content strategist with extensive experience leading award-winning content programs that inspire others and also achieve business outcomes. Before Edelman, she led content marketing at B2B agency Gyro. And before that, she led editorial and content strategy for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she launched and managed the Met Blog's Content Hub, earning a Webby Award for the best cultural blog on the web. We are honored to have her with us again today on the Trailblazers. Welcome back, Annie.
Thank you, Perry. It's so good to be here and really appreciate your having me back for a second episode. Happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you back as well. All right, so before we get into this, I want to just share something with the audience. And that's something that has been discovered by Edelman's annual research and published in the Thought Leadership Impact Study for 6 years, a study that's been going on for 7 years. And that is that quality thought leadership content has a significant impact and influence on business decision makers. And that's the opinion of the business decision makers. And the best way to engage customers in the early stages of their buyer's journey is with thought leadership content. However, and this is a big however, and some of our listeners may fall into this category, most organizations don't include thought leadership content in their marketing communications, and it's because they don't know how. They don't know how to resource it, create it, distribute it, and measure its results. And that's been common in every one of Edelman's studies. So with all of that said, today with Annie, we're going to dive into the how-to aspects of using thought leadership content. So the first question, Annie, and this is the first thing that grabbed my attention when I was preparing for this, is the name of your approach to employing thought leadership content is the Flywheel. And that harkens us back to an industrial age term, an innovation, but an industrial age term nonetheless. So why the Flywheel? What's the story behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in machinery, and I am not an expert on machinery, but a flywheel is a heavy wheel that rotates and stores energy and I guess sort of releases it as needed. And the momentum that builds up from the rotation of the wheel allows the wheel to keep itself going with sort of minimal additional energy. And that was the inspiration for the name of, the Edelman Thought Leadership Flywheel, because our framework is intended to work in much the same way. So it includes 6 best practices for creating successful thought leadership. And the idea is that if you do several of those pieces correctly and you do them well, each of those pieces creates momentum to sustain the program and continue to drive it forward.
I love it. I really love that term, and great explanation as well. So what are the 6 elements, the 6 disciplines within the Flywheel?
So there are 6 elements of the flywheel, and I'll go through each of them. Number 1 is capitalize on white space. So making sure that when you're creating thought leadership, you're finding opportunities where your brand can own and lead timely conversations about what's going on in the space. That's number 1. Number 2 is be relevant. So understanding what your customers care about so you can create content that aligns with their interests and their challenges and what they're thinking. Number 3 is set a vision. So helping your customers see around corners, understanding where the industry is going, and helping them prepare for whatever may be sort of coming down the pike in their industry or for their business. Number 4 is earn trust. So you always want to be a credible source of information and gain and maintain the trust of your readers and your customers and your stakeholders, whoever you're trying to reach. Number 5 is be concise. So people are busy, professionals are busy, time is of the essence. So making sure you're delivering your content with impact and getting the hard-hitting takeaways to them sort of as efficiently and engagingly as possible. And number 6, measure progress. And this is such an important one, because if you want to demonstrate the value of your program kind of within your organization, up the chain to company leadership, you need to be able to properly measure its impact. So measurement is really a critical component of this.
Excellent. Okay. So they're all components that work together. They're not linear, they're not stages or anything like that. But I'm going to go to the end of your list. So I'd like to start with something which I believe is probably the most elusive and probably the thing that falls out of somebody's strategy, and that is measuring results. So we're going to do a deep dive into all of these, but can you start there and just talk about how to do that and the importance of that?
Absolutely. So when it comes to measurement, before deciding what to measure, it's really important that you think about what success looks like within your particular organization, and not just from a marketing perspective, right? So what would success look like to your company leadership? If you sit in marketing, what would success look like to your sales team and your colleagues over there? So from a business perspective, is the goal to shift perception among your customers in a certain way? Is it to become better known with a certain audience that maybe you're not currently reaching? Or do you want to become better known for a certain set of capabilities that maybe you're not as well known for at the moment? So once you kind of define what success looks like, you can work backwards from there. And so you can work backwards to figure out what metrics do you want to track to show how your program is driving positive outcomes with your target audiences. And from there, what tools do you want to use and implement to measure the performance of your content against your priorities? So often folks may start from a perspective of, do I have the right measurement tools in place, or what tools do I want to use? I would kind of say, park that for a moment and think about, what do you want to drive? Then how do you measure against what you want to drive? And then you can figure out what the right tools are to measure progress against your business priorities.
So important. I mean, a lot of organizations jump right past that. They start doing, and then they figure out what's happening, and then they try to measure that, and it does. It's so obvious that's backwards. So when you talked about success criteria, what advice do you have on how do you write a success criteria statement, or think of it? What are the components of that?
I think you want to think about who you're trying to reach. So really defining who the target audience is that you're trying to reach and influence. What are you trying to get them to do? What do you want them to think? What do you want them to feel about your company? And how are you going to do that? So one sort of framework that we've often used in the past is get to buy. So you want to get the name of the audience, to feel something, do something, think something. And then buy is the manner, the means by which you do that, by creating thought leadership content that tells the story of X or shows Y. So that framework can kind of be helpful for codifying what you're trying to do with your program. And then you can sort of march that around your organization and say, does this feel right? Does that feel right? Is something missing? And it can kind of help as a forcing function or way to get people all on the same page in terms of what you want the program to do and what would be most helpful and impactful for the organization.
That's brilliant. I really love that. Get your target audience to do something by doing. Yeah, I really like that. When you first said buy, I was thinking BUI.
Oh, right.
That's not it. By doing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. All about the customer. It's all customer focused. That's brilliant. Now there's a socializing across your organization that you alluded to. And so does it look different when you socialize that with sales?
I think partnership with sales is really, really important. So making sure that the sales organization and the marketing organization are aligning on what KPIs would be important to track. Because if you're creating thought leadership content at the top of the funnel, the goal is not just to get content out into the world, but it's to generate demand that ultimately the sales team can capture and act upon. So making sure that you're tracking KPIs that allow you to measure what your customers are doing and your stakeholders are doing all the way from the top of the funnel and their journey through to the bottom, ultimately to the sale and eventually, cross-selling. It's super important to have that connectivity.
Excellent. That's really great. I hear more and more really good marketers are spending a lot more time socializing their work and the outcomes they're trying to achieve with the rest of the organization. And I think you really explained what right looks like there in that definition. Okay, so let's go to the next element. Now I'll go back to the beginning, and this was the second one you brought up: white space and pain points. So, what is white space, and what are pain points, and why is that even important to be included in this?
Yeah, absolutely. So capitalizing on white space means finding opportunities where your brand can sort of carve out an ownable niche for itself that doesn't really blend in with what everyone else is saying, or even really what the sort of expected point of view is on a given topic. It's okay to be a little bit provocative or come up with an argument that maybe is a little bit less expected. And because really what we know is executives prefer to read things that challenge what they already know. They want to hear something new. They want to hear something that's interesting to them versus things that just confirm what they already know, which is great. So in terms of finding the white space, it's really about coming up with topics that sit at the intersection between, first, what's going on in the industry, what is driving media coverage, what's driving conversation in the space among customers, among providers. The second piece is what challenges your customers are facing and what their pain points are. So what are they confronting in their business? What are they trying to do? Are they confronted with market forces that are, exerting pressure on their business that they need to deal with? And the third piece is what your company's growth priorities are, because you want to be known for what you want to be known for. So as you think about what is that space that you can carve out for yourself, where you're creating content and saying something new and saying something interesting, you do want to make sure that whatever you're saying has a payoff for your brand so that you're being known sort of in the places and spaces where you want to be known and how you want to be perceived.
Some of our listeners may be thinking, well, I've got to invest in a lot of market research to do the things you're talking about. But I think you're going to say that you don't necessarily have to do that.
I would say that. I think you don't necessarily have to do that. And this dovetails with the next point too, which is about being relevant. Talk to your sales team. If your sales team and your customer relationship managers, they sit within your organization. They are really a wealth of knowledge from talking directly to your customers and perhaps being the people within your organization who are closest to your customers. They talk to them all the time about what they're going through, what challenges they're facing, whether it's a challenge, with your product or service or with something else that's going on externally. They're a great source of information and they're your colleagues. So you don't have to pay for extensive market research to talk to customers, further afield. You can talk to really great proxies directly within your organization.
And how about the white space? That doesn't necessarily require a lot of marketing research resources, right?
It doesn't. I think if you are paying attention to what's going on in the media and seeing what's driving conversation, and maybe there's a perspective that as an expert in the space that you feel like you're not seeing out there, that might be white space you want to pursue. And obviously think about that white space in terms of whether your customers care about that white space, because you want to talk about things that are relevant to them, but looking at it that way and figuring out what are people not talking about or thinking about right now that they should. That can kind of be a good way to figure out, where do I create content to add value to a conversation that either is happening or starting a new conversation that hasn't yet come into play.
So the next component, you already introduced us to it, be relevant, and you talked about the value of the sales team and other customer facing folks in your organization. So can you talk a little bit more about that, being relevant, and how to do that?
Absolutely. So when you create content, you want to make sure that you're creating content and adding value to the people you're trying to reach and influence. So strong thought leadership really needs to be closely mapped to your customers' needs. I think it's easy to fall into a trap, perhaps, where you're trying to be everything to everyone. But if you really sort of maintain a laser focus on the specific audiences you want to reach and what they care about, that can really be helpful to making sure that your content isn't getting watered down or trying to do too many things at once, but that it really is focused on what is most relevant to the people you're trying to reach, what their interests are, to the challenges and opportunities facing their business. And that's going to drive the deepest engagement with them.
I imagine that requires a lot of organizational discipline. I'm picturing those good idea sessions where everybody's providing input. You want to be collaborative, you want to have that culture, but it can really steer you off of this need to be relevant to your target audience.
It can, but I think if you focus internally on specific audiences and making sure that you're crafting content to specific audiences. And it can be multiple audiences, but maybe it requires multiple content streams or multiple content franchises. You just want to make sure that you're creating content that is useful to a given audience and adds value for them. And obviously, people within the organization have different stakeholders and are trying to reach different folks. But I think at that point, that's just opportunity to create different campaigns that are trying to achieve different goals versus maybe trying to kill, too many birds with one stone. You want to be a little bit more targeted.
So before we go to the next component, I want to ask you about that term you just used, content franchise. What's that?
I think you can create a specific piece of content and have it be a one-off. So a white paper, a blog post, but it's hard to scale a content program if you just do one and done, create content, push it out, and move on to the next thing. Something we really see a lot of success with organizations who are scaling their content programs and trying to drive greater efficiency is creating one piece of content and then either chopping it up into other pieces of content, or in terms of building a franchise, creating a report 1 year. And much like we do with the Edelman LinkedIn B2B Thought Leadership Impact Report that you mentioned, Perry, tracking the same data and doing new versions of a piece year over year can really create followership that's really valuable. People can come to expect that piece of content. So it can sort of engender trust and followership and increased engagement and momentum over time.
Excellent. Well, Annie, the next one is set a vision. And so when I first, as I was reading through these ahead of our interview, I said, set a vision. Well, didn't we do that when we talked about outcomes? But that's not what this means. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So this is a little bit different. So when we were talking about measurement and setting what the outcomes were within the organization, what business goals we wanted to drive, that's one thing, and that's super important. But this piece about setting a vision is setting a vision within your content. So decision makers want to know where their industry is going. People want to know how they can stay ahead and maintain an edge in whatever their industry is. So I think the thinking here is, rather than producing a piece that's simply, and this is just an example, top 5 trends in industry X in the year ahead, you want to make it more actionable. You want to explain how your readers can capitalize on those trends or evolve their business in relation to those trends so that they can stay ahead. And I think that's particularly important with more senior decision makers and customers, because they're trying to figure out how to confront what's coming down the pike and adapt their business accordingly. So that sort of big picture thinking is really important to help them see around those corners and leverage your expertise to help them run their business and keep running their business in the future.
I like how they're all interrelated. So when you describe that, I'm thinking back to the white space you spoke about, the pain points. They're all related. That'll help you kind of establish a vision in that space.
Absolutely. So it's figuring out what are people not saying that you can use to generate interest in your organization by saying something novel and saying something interesting. But you also want to make sure that white space is forward looking, because people are trying to prepare their business for the year ahead versus, perhaps looking back. They want to know what's next because they want to stay on the cutting edge and they want to be aligned with providers who are on the cutting edge of insights. So that helps your business position itself well to potentially be a partner because you're showing that you have the expertise and know what's going to happen next.
All right. So the next element, Annie, is about earning trust. And I know Edelman has an entire effort on trust, related to trust, a big effort there. You can speak about that a little bit. But people in this space, in B2B, these complex, large, long-lasting contractual relationships are really more like partnerships, and trust is at the center of those. So how do you approach that within this flywheel concept?
Yeah. So earning trust is such a critical piece of developing a thought leadership program because for people to trust you with their business, they first need to trust you just as a credible source of information. And what's great about this and sort of the shoulders to stand on when it comes to trust and thought leadership is thought leadership in and of itself is viewed as trustworthy. So in our annual report and in the most recent iteration of it, we found that about 3/4 of decision makers say that thought leadership content is a more trustworthy basis for assessing an organization's capabilities and competencies. So more so than product materials and and product collateral. So for that reason, it's really important that thought leadership not come off as sales material, sort of masquerading as thought leadership. It really needs to provide genuine value and information that your audiences can use so that they view you as an expert who's knowledgeable in the space. And that's really what you want to get out of it, showing that you know what's going on in the space, that you are on the cutting edge of where things are going. And there's 2 tips for this. So in terms of, generating trust through your thought leadership, the first is use your people. So people like to hear from other people. So leveraging your senior executives and your subject matter experts to create content and amplify the content you're putting out can go a long way so that your thought leadership is coming from identifiable known experts versus perhaps sort of the faceless your faceless brand. People want to hear from other people and their perspectives. The second piece is leveraging third-party experts, which you can do as well. So if you are able to align yourself with trusted, recognizable voices outside your company, whether it's including data from other sources or insights from people who are trusted that are outside your organization, and those people are already known and trusted by your target audience, that can go a long way to reinforcing your credibility as well.
Great advice, subject matter experts and third-party experts. So I want to talk about the first part of that, which is subject matter experts in your own organization. A lot of marketers try to engage potential subject matter experts and they get a little resistance. They don't want to be part of that. Maybe they're too busy. Any advice on how to get subject matter experts involved in content?
Yeah, I think it kind of comes back to measurement and something that we spoke about before. If you are able to show internally the value of your thought leadership program to your organization, that can go a long way to convincing maybe if there are skeptics within your organization that what you're doing with your content, you're using it to drive trust, you're using it to generate greater demand for your business's products and services, show that your business has expertise in a certain area. And if you're able to show successes that you've had to date and show the metrics that you've reached the right people at the right companies and are really driving impact for the organization, that can really go a long way to convincing folks up the chain and elsewhere within an organization that the program is meaningful and driving impact and something that they ideally would want to get involved with.
Great advice. All of these are another example of how they're all interrelated. You went back to, the very first thing you spoke about, which was, establishing success criteria and socializing it throughout your organization. So really good stuff. The final element we haven't spoken about is be concise, which is hard. I've seen horrible examples of not being concise where, you get these little working groups who are content creators and and they create these 6,000 word pieces that are just too long and don't capture anybody's attention. So can you talk a little bit about how to go about that, why it's important?
Yeah. So people are busy. Professionals are very busy. They have limited time and they often have limited attention to dig into and focus on really lengthy pieces of content. I see what you're talking about, Perry. I've seen 35-page white papers and 40, 100-page documents, and those absolutely have a place and may be fascinating research that's really important to dig into. But I think there's ways to make it more digestible for folks. And I think there's two pieces here. The first is think in terms of headlines. So is there a key piece of data or an insight within the piece that really would be particularly interesting to readers? Or for instance, let's say there were a reporter who were covering in a journalistic way your piece of thought leadership. What would be interesting to them? What would they find most interesting from your piece to sort of pass along to others or discuss with their colleagues? And then you can craft the story around those really attention-grabbing insights. So you're leading with what is most memorable and what is going to be most impactful. So thinking in terms of headlines, that's number one. And number two is if you have a longer piece of content, like a white paper, we talked about, like a 35-page piece of research, obviously super important. Think about how you can maybe chop that up into smaller, more digestible pieces of content in different formats. So could it be a video? Could you have an executive speaking to the highlights of that piece of research in a quick 90-second video? Could it be audio? Could it be an email or a shorter article that maybe pulls out some of the themes in the larger piece, or a series of articles that tease out themes in the larger piece, or maybe are personalized for specific audiences? And those pieces, sort of the derivative pieces of content that you can create off that larger piece, they'll be easier to digest, but you can also use them to pique interest in the larger piece and drive readers to read your larger piece once you've sort of gotten their attention.
Yeah, great. I mean, we operate in a blog, I don't mean this negatively, but we operate in a blog mentality nowadays. We're all so busy, we're inundated with, digital content, and we want to just get enough that we're interested in. But what you're speaking about, that first point, that's really journalism. That's journalism 101.
Absolutely. I think if you're approaching thought leadership from the perspective of how can I create content that's useful and helpful and provides genuine value to the reader, and thinking about it as a journalist, that's really going to drive maximum engagement. And that's sort of above and beyond approaching thought leadership from the perspective of how can I use this content to sell my products and services? Because people are very aware consumers of information. They know when they're being sold to. So if you come at it from the perspective of how can I provide value, tell somebody something they may not already know, and show my expertise versus using thought leadership to try and make a sale, it's going to be that much more successful and come off as more genuine for your organization.
Yeah, that's really great stuff. Wonderful. So, Annie, I think we covered all six components of the flywheel. So, really, really great stuff. I want to ask you one final question on this for somebody who's never done this. This is could be a big change in their organization, a cultural change, a big shift. How would you recommend going about that?
Absolutely. I think it really depends on where thought leadership is in terms of its maturity within your organization. So we talked about sort of these 6 best practices for thought leadership, the 6 elements of our flywheel. And when we say that if you start with one piece or or do a couple of pieces and maybe build your way up to doing all 6 of these things, the more elements that you add, the idea is that they generate momentum over time and continue to sustain the program forward. So I would start with whatever feels easiest and most approachable to you. Maybe it's not meeting with your sales organization to align on KPIs. Maybe it's starting with the be concise point and taking an existing piece of content that you have and pulling out what the headlines are, or taking a larger piece of content and chopping it up into smaller pieces to make them more digestible. I would say just don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, and start somewhere. And I think that's going to pay dividends over time for your program.
Perfect. That's great advice. I like your last point. Don't hold out for perfect. Just start. Try something. You can always adjust. All right. So I've been speaking with Annie Dunleavy. How can our listeners contact you so they can get some help? I know you're experts in this. You're the head expert in doing this. How can they contact you so they can get some additional help?
We're always happy to have conversations with folks and talk with people. You can go to edelman.com and download our B2B Thought Leadership Impact Report, or go to our Edelman Business Marketing page to contact us. And we'd be happy to have a conversation and help you with your thought leadership program.
The impact report is awesome. I look at it every year. I became aware of it about 4 years ago, and I recommend it for everybody. It's just such a great body of research and really well explained. You follow all the things we just spoke about. It's concise, clear, relevant. You're addressing white space, so it's just a really good report. So yeah, thank you for doing that each year. So, Annie, thank you again for being part of the Trailblazers. Again, I've been speaking with Annie Dunleavy. She is the Executive Vice President and U.S. Head of Content Strategy for Edelman Business Marketing. Annie, thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, thank you, Perry. It's great to be back and appreciate you taking the time. This was fantastic.